everyone. My name's Francis, and this is a recording of the keynote I gave in 2025 at the TCUK UK, that's TCUK conference, which was held in Nottingham. The topic is the ISO standard, and I want to ask the question, is your document in plain language? And I want to try and give you some guidelines to answer that question. So in today's agenda, there are three things we'll discuss. The part one, I want to focus on the standard itself. So what it is, how it defines plain language, why we need it, and so on. Part two is about readability. And part three is about what you have to do to align with ISO 24495. Little bit about myself. I've been in the fields of content in digital communications and technical communications for close on 3 decades. My focus area or my expertise is centered around plain language. I am the UK ambassador for an organization called PLAIN, which stands for the Plain Language Association International Network. And it's a great association to join. Because there's lots of webinars and resource and a journal on the field of plain language. If you're interested, you can contact me. My details are at the end of this presentation, or you can look up Plain itself on the web and join through their website. I'm also a member of Clarity, which is an organization focused on legal content, and I've also put details of the International Plain Language Federation because I sit on a couple of committees there, most notably the one for localization of the standard. I'm also an expert contributor for the British Standards Institute on the ISO standard in plain language. I head up a consultancy and training firm called Narratology. I thought we'd start off by just discussing a little bit of the contextual history around plain language. And the first slide here is to remember Martin Cutts, a pioneer of plain language in the UK, who sadly passed away earlier in 2026. Martin's plain language activism started in the 1970s. He had a problem with the fact that legislation was written in a way that was not accessible, that was not understandable to the very people it affected. And in fact, he did all sorts of protest actions. For example, setting fire to some legislation outside the Houses of Parliament, something he warned other people to please not copy. More seriously, he's introduced a clear language stamp in the UK, and he wrote many works, including the Oxford Guide to Plain English, and a book which gave a critique of the plain English movement called Nailing the Lies, and a lot of his work is accessible online. I started working seriously in the field in the 1990s, and I put together a very snapshot of what I found working in plain language over the past couple of decades. In the 1990s, my work was really focused on information design and using information design not only to be clear, but also to cut costs. So I did many jobs where we would reduce the need for having a whole lot of mailings inside an envelope with a bill or a statement, by using laser print technology, Cobalt anyone, to put customized and personalized messaging on the bill or the statement instead of having to include those bulky inserts in the envelope. And in that way, we cut a lot of costs and use technology to improve customer experience. In the 2000s, we talked a lot about using plain language or simplified communication to build brand, because there became a lot of awareness of the correlation between trust in a brand or trust in a process and the clarity of instructions in that process. There's also a lot of interest in the intangible value of a brand, which often is the value of the language and of the communication. For me, the 2010s, what stood out were the many laws and regulations that were introduced to make sure that businesses and governments spoke in plain language. So in the UK, there's the Equality Act, which gave everybody the right to understand the same information. In 2015, the Consumer Rights Act, which really pushed retail organizations to give consumers clear information. Obviously, there is the plethora of accessibility standards, guidelines, and regulations that came out as well, and even the start of laws mandating accessible digital communications. Also in the 2010s was a very important law called the Plain Writing Act in the US, which was a law that obliges federal government in the US to communicate in plain language. So what do the 2020s bring us? Well, they bring us the standard. The ISO standard in plain language is the big change in the field this year. And it's not the standard in itself, but it's how the standard will work in alignment with user experience and accessibility initiatives that I think is very interesting. Obviously, I've taken for granted that everybody will be involved in AI because obviously that's a field that we're all interested in. Now we've got these standards, how do we scale them using AI responsibly? When it comes to the ISO standard, well, what standards are ready for us right now to use? The guideline standard, the governing principles and guidelines, was brought out actually in 2023. And that gives the definition of plain language and the 4 pillars that I'll talk a lot about in this keynote. We also have a part which is applied specifically to legal communications, such as terms and conditions or contracts. On the BSI website, you'll see the standards for part 1 and part 2, and you'll also see the draft for science writing. As of January 26, here are screenshots from the ISO website of the standards under development. So we've got the science writing, as I mentioned, the draft is in its approval phase. Then very excitedly, we've got part 4. And part 4 is called Requirements for Implementing the Plain Language Principles in Organizations. And you'll see that a draft is being reviewed by the committee. This is a very important standard because this is when you could work on actually complying with the standard for plain language. It moves from just the guidelines of part 1, part 2, part 3 to a requirement standard. There's also various other standards under development, including a notation for business reporting and standards associated with design. You might be asking yourself by now, well, why did we need a standard in the first place? Well, back in 2009, 2010, when all of this started, I think for me, what was interesting about the standard is that I had realized that as a plain language practitioner myself, I had a slightly different criteria to other plain language practitioners. What was plain to me wasn't necessarily plain to everybody. Everybody worked on their own sets of criteria for plain language. Sometimes even there was over-reliance on very simplistic plain English checklists. And I think this comes about because plain language practitioners often do a lot of training. And when you train people who are not experts, you produce kind of simple checklists to work through. And I think in some ways those checklists somehow started defining what plain language was and became oversimplistic. So we wanted to professionalize the field of plain language to get credibility to the notion of plain language. And that was why we needed a standard. So I want to talk about what plain language is according to the standard. So one interesting definition goes like this. A communication is in plain language if its wording, structure, and design are so clear that the intended readers can easily find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information. You'll notice a lot of important points in this definition. Firstly, it's not only about wording. In fact, the very definition of plain language talks about wording, structure, and design. Another very interesting thing is that it doesn't talk about everyone. It talks about the intended readers, the target readers. That's who we're interested in. And again, it's not just about understanding, it's also about finding the information they need, understanding what they find, and very importantly, that information being actually useful and usable by people to meet their needs. Just to give you a framework of where the standards are being developed, it's in Technical Subcommittee 37, Language and Terminology, and the plain language standards is in a group called Working Group 11, and you'll see there's many very important and interesting standards to the fields of technical communication and localization around the plain language standard. So far, the standard has been used and localized and implemented quite differently across the different countries because the standard was designed to be language agnostic. 50 plain language experts from 25 countries were involved in drafting and approving the standard, and this represents 19 languages. The standard itself has been translated into, I think, over 16 languages now. Just to some examples of the varied implementations, the Polish Banking Association adopted a declaration for plain language. Canada has localized the standard into the clear language and presentation principles and guidelines for the Financial Consumer Agency. And the Bank of Canada adopted this standard. In South Africa, financial regulators are involved in the working group of the local South African standard. So in all the different countries, there's slightly different types of implementations and adoptions. But the principles, the beauty of the standard and the elegance of the standard is the principles are the same. No matter how it's being adopted in different countries and in different sectors, the principles and the guidelines underneath the principles remain consistent. The first principle is about relevant, so readers get what they need. The second principle, findable, readers can easily find what they need. The third one is understandable. Readers can easily understand what they find. And the fourth one is usable. Readers can easily use the information. And this principle talks a lot about monitoring and evaluation, co-creation, user testing, these types of concepts. You can also see these principles and these parts of the standard as a learning cycle aligned to how we often think about communications. So we first have understanding the reader, then we have designing the information, which is findability and understandability, and then we have monitoring and evaluation, which is this whole idea of co-creation and user testing and measuring against metrics. And again, that iterative process, which then once again goes into understanding the reader, understanding how to produce relevant information. So now you know the basics of the standard, I'll move on to talking about a specific interesting element, which is readability and readability scores. When we're evaluating plain language, we can see evaluations going from very text-based to very reader or context-based. And the most text-based type of evaluation would be readability scoring, which is done simply on the text with really no real consideration of the target audience. So that is very text-based readability. In the middle would be heuristics or criteria-based testing, and right on the context-based would be user testing or outcomes-based testing. So there's a continuum between these different kinds of testing. Some of these kinds of testing are more easy to automate, especially with AI, than others. So readability is something that's easy to automate. User testing is obviously much more difficult to automate. So we've got different kinds of ways of doing all these evaluations of plain language. But what the plain language standard does is it warns us to not overuse readability scores. it says don't overuse mechanical measures such as readability formulas. And I want to talk a little bit about why. But let's talk about what readability scores are. And one of the best known examples is the Flesch-Kincaid grade level. This table is from one of the Associated Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And basically what this Flesch-Kincaid grade level standard does is it has a formula of how many words per sentence and how many syllables per word. So how long a sentence is and how long a word is. And out of those numbers, it gives a score. And out of those scores, it matches that to what they call a grade level. And these grade levels, so they have nothing to do with actual education levels. It's really got to do with just how long sentences are and how long words are. And the grade levels aren't worked out in the UK. And they're not most aren't worked out within this generation. So it doesn't really relate directly. So when it says 8th or 9th grade, plain English, easily understood by 13 to 15-year-old students, that's not necessarily students you'd be working with or adults you'd be working with. Remember, we don't very few technical communications or legal communications actually are written for children, although some are. But don't confuse these 9th graders with actual 9th graders in schools, because this is a very theoretical test. In fact, is this Flesch-Kincaid different to other readability scoring? Not really. Most, if not all, readability scoring has some variation of how long a sentence is and how long a word is. There are sometimes a few more details in them, but they don't really go beyond that. They're very textual based and not reader based. So let's look at what the negatives are of this. One of the negatives are that sentence length isn't a strong enough predictor. And I'm going to discuss that in this section of why I say sentence length does not really predict whether people can understand. And it doesn't predict that even linguistically, even just in terms of words, the most basic level. Of course, there are many other reasons why readability isn't the end-all criteria for plain language. For example, design and structure and many other factors might matter even more. The base knowledge of the reader and their motivation are also very important. And often the relationship with grade levels is often misunderstood. As I already said, the 8th grade level doesn't mean literally somebody at school, because children read and understand things differently to adults. We also must remember that even in one day, our literacy levels will go up and down. For instance, if we're stressed, if we're sick, if we're interrupted, if we're using an unfamiliar channel, our own literacy levels might change. So your literacy level isn't really only determined by your education level. In fact, that might not be the most important factor. In this presentation, I can't go through all of it, but I do want to do a bit of a deep dive into the linguistic reasons, the language reasons why sentence length is a good predictor of plain language. When you look at the length of a sentence, many style guides, in fact, pretty much all of them will say make your sentences short. And some of them actually give a length of your sentences. And of course, there are just some words that are unnecessary in a sentence, and the sentence will be made better without these words. For example, normalization. So instead of saying we made a decision, we conducted the training, we did the implementation, we could say we decided, we trained, we implemented. So we can definitely edit out a lot of words there. Also in English, there's just lots of extra words sometimes. So we say things like because of the fact that, or in order to, where we could just say because or to. But these are little edits that we can do, but there's often short sentences that look quite simple to a highly literate person who knows context, might actually have hidden complexity. Short sentences can be ambiguous and are often not plain language. I'm going to show you an example here. One morning, I chased an elephant in my pajamas. We intuitively understand the sentence as having a particular syntactic or grammatical structure. So we have a sentence, we have a noun phrase, which is just I. Forget the one morning for a minute. So we just have a noun phrase, which is I. And then we have a verb phrase, which is made up of the verb phrase, chased an elephant, and a prepositional phrase, which is in my pajamas. So I chased an elephant in my pajamas. But this sentence happens to be a joke, a very old, corny joke. And the punchline is, one morning I chased an elephant in my pajamas. How he got in my pajamas, I don't know. So here we have a different syntactic structure, something we didn't expect. We have the noun phrase I, but then we have the verb phrase, which is broken up to a verb and then a noun phrase, the verb being chased, the noun phrase being an elephant in my pajamas. So now in my pajamas belongs to the elephant. It doesn't belong to chased anymore. So this was unexpected, and that's why the joke is funny. And a lot of jokes are just great things that linguists can use to show a point. Think to yourself now, if you were talking about something that needed to be crystal clear without any ambiguity, what would you do to the sentence to make it clear? I chased an elephant in my pajamas. Well, if you wanted the second meaning, you'd say, I chased an elephant who was wearing my pajamas. So you'd have to put words in to make the sentence clear. If you wanted the other meaning, you might have to say something like, when I was wearing my pajamas, I chased an elephant, or I chased an elephant while I was dressed in my pajamas. So you have to put sentences in, put words in to the sentence to make it clear. So you can see it's quite problematic to say, well, every short sentence is clear and every long sentence is not clear. Another nice example is that when you look at the order of the sentence, and often in English speakers, we intuitively think things are written in a subject, verb, object way. So let's look at this headline. PM sent questionnaire on parties. Without any context, if we know nothing about this, we'll understand it as a noun, a subject, a verb, and then another noun, an object. Subject, verb, object. So PM sent questionnaire on parties. That will be our intuition. However, because most people who are watching will know some context behind this and behind the way headlines are written, we'll see a hidden passive. And actually, the sentence is object, verb, subject. It's passive. A questionnaire on parties was sent. We don't know by who. That's left out here. And it was sent to the PM. The intended meaning was the police sent questionnaire on parties to the PM. So again, even though that headline was made really short, it did not mean it's clear to people who did not understand the context, or people who were hurrying and did not have high literacy at that moment, or people who are low literacy and don't read well, or people who have a disability or are neurodiverse and have dyslexia. So there are many reasons why we want to be absolutely clear in our language and not abbreviate to the degree that we introduce ambiguity, a lack of clarity. This kind of thing is called in linguistics a word-deletion. It gets sentences shorter but can cause ambiguity. And I've seen plain language checklists that say things like remove all words you don't need, keep things as short as possible. And I've even seen ones that say remove who is and to be. The problem is we often aren't clear. So if you look at a sentence such as the system wants the report generated by the user, we don't know if it means the system requires the report that was generated by the user, or inactive, the system requires the report that the user generated, or the system wants the report to be generated by the user. So again, to make this clear, we have to put these words in. So if we look at just a readability score, an automated thing that's just going to look at sentence length, it's not going to be good enough. It will tell us when things are really bad, cannot tell us if things are good. So as a literate reader, when it comes to words deletion, you'll only have a problem when things are really, really confusing. So look at this example. The presentation the journalist, the editor, and Mike gave was controversial. At this point, most of us, not all, but most of us will be struggling to understand the sentence. We'll be struggling to add in all these bits of the sentence that have been abbreviated or truncated. Because we meant the presentation that the journalist who the editor admired gave was controversial. And as you're struggling with that, remember that people who are less literate or don't understand context will struggle with abbreviated sentences that you are putting together. This problem specifically comes out in UX writing, which is a field where one always wants to make things as short as possible, but at the risk of being ambiguous. Settled your amount in personal loans. I had this string user tested once, and I found that people, instead of understanding personal loans as a menu item, they understood it as their own bank account. This is an easy ambiguity that arises when you have very few words to play with. So we know that readability scores, at least on their own, won't work. How do we use the standard as a process? Let's look at this standard in more detail of what the process is, what it actually says. And at this point, I think it's really important to point out that you have to buy the standard. I can't tell you what the standard is in this presentation, but I can talk around some of the main principles so you get the gist, and I'm really hoping you're inspired to buy the standard. Principle 1, remember that's relevance. So readers get what they need. And what the standard says is that before you start growing your tree, you need to prepare the ground. So you need to understand your reader. You need to know why they're reading, their motivations. You need to know their context. You need to think about the best channel and format of the piece of content. You need to make sure that you're providing accurate, not false or not misleading content. And omissions are also important. So if you haven't said something that is important, that also doesn't comply with plain language. Plain language is not only the how it's written, but in terms of this principle, it's actually what you put into the communication as well. It's not just style, it is also substance. Also, when you go through principle 1, you realize that you have to, if you are going to use AI to help you write, make sure that the AI model can understand or can process who the reader is and all of the things you need to know about the reader. Otherwise, you don't really comply with the standard. You have to look at literacy and language skills and realize the particular context, and if it's a stressful context or the user is tired when they're reading, you're going to have to write a little bit differently and present numbers a little bit differently. Let's look at that in a little more detail. We know, I've explained a few times in this presentation, that we're all low literacy at times, so we need to always cater for low literacy in our communications. For the past many years in digital communications, we've talked a lot about skimming or scanning, and a lot of that work came from Jacob Nielsen's work. And you can see an excerpt from the Nielsen website here. It says, on the average web page, users have time to read at most 28% of the words during a visit and 20% more likely. And these studies showed that these users scan, they don't skim. They were done usually on university employees, and they were done in a very non-stressful context. One of the interesting things that perhaps we need to also consider, besides this common behavior of scanning, is that very low literacy people do not scan. So skimming or scanning, I use those words interchangeably, skimming or scanning, is actually a high literacy behavior. And I'm going to explain to you an example of why I say this. When I want you to think back of a time when you had to read something really quickly. It could have been instructions for a medication that you were taking and you weren't feeling well at the time. It could be directions when you were trying to drive somewhere in a rush. It could be instructions for a piece of software, a help file for a piece of software that you just didn't really get and didn't want to use and didn't have the context to. And you know that feeling where you go down the page and you scroll back up and you scroll back down and nothing is going in. Eventually, what you'll probably do, if you're motivated to actually carry on at all, is you'll read the first few lines word for word and you'll go, step 1, click on return and put this component in. Open, you'll read things very slowly, word by word. At that point, your literacy level has gone down. So what you're doing is you're reverting from your high literacy scanning type of behavior to a low literacy behavior, which is not scanning. It's reading every word very, very carefully in blocks. And often that low literacy behavior goes with just reading a certain amount until you're satisfied and not reading all of it. So when we write, we have to not only write for these high literacy users at the time, but also remember there are different other ways of reading and put that into our documentation as well. We've all heard the saying, well, users don't want to read this anyway, where it's technical documentation or instructions. And I always say, don't assume because you don't want to read something that all your users won't, because my experience is the more vulnerable the user is, the more they want to read documentation. So there's always a danger of people using their own assumptions about whether people will read this. And of course, remember, when content has been really badly written, then obviously people will not want to read it. One of the other things we need to look at when it comes to relevance is base level of knowledge. So this shows a very, very typical example in what's often called a low financial literacy group. You'll get a very low level of expertise with some products. So this one was home or contents insurance and notions like excess or additional amount. But then there's some things where this group has a very high level of expertise. For example, in using WhatsApp. In knowing what a contract is, because vulnerable people tend to know what contracts are because they've been caught out. If they're living in a time where high interest rates is, they understand interest intimately. And they also, if you're struggling with money, you understand budgeting extremely well from a day-to-day level to a weekly level, to a monthly level, to a long-term level. Budgeting is actually a high level of expertise. And in this particular group, there was a high level of expertise on funeral cover because this group had experienced a death in their family. So often we look out and we go, well, this group has low digital expertise or high financial expertise, but we have to realize that base level of knowledge is often quite mixed and you have to deep dive into it to understand your readers. And why is this important? Because we can then use this base level of expertise to explain things better, to explain one thing, one unknown thing, in terms of another thing that is known. So here's a great example. This is an example from South Africa, and it's when funeral cover, funeral insurance, was being introduced as part of a financial inclusion initiative. And what the research had shown is a lot of the market, the intended audience for these funeral cover policies, they didn't know much about these policies, but they knew a lot about mobile data packages. They were used to buying data. So what this particular initiative did, which was very, very smart, it explained funeral policies in a way that's similar to mobile data packages. So a user would easily have some familiarity with the packaging, with the presentation, with the way costs were presented. And the task was then to explain ways it differed rather than have to take things from, absolute position of knowing nothing. So that really investigating what an audience does know as opposed to what they don't know is really important. Often we're a bit obsessed with looking at what people don't know. We need to look at what people know, even if it's not on that topic and might be on a parallel topic. The next principle after relevant is findable. So you need to now be able to see the wood for the trees. You need to structure the content in a reader-focused way. Use information design techniques, headings, and if there is supplementary information, perhaps keep it separate. A lot of this type of information is quite similar to what you'd find in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as well. One interesting thing about findable structure when it comes to plain language is, especially with AI, it's become very easy to put a whole lot of complex information into a tool and come up with a simple explanation on the side. And I personally really don't think, this is my personal belief, don't think that this kind of thing is in plain language. Because what you're saying is the bit on the right that is simple, that's what somebody must read. But actually the bit on the left, that really complex bit with lots of the caps in, that's the bit that actually applies. So it's very important that all the information is in plain language, because the reader needs to be able to access all of it and not just the little plain language summaries on the side. Then we get to understandable, which is more what you're used to, I think, hearing about when it comes to plain English, which is things like familiar words, your subject-verb order, your simple sentences, and your tone guidance. But I hope I've explained to you that often we've been oversimplifying what, for example, a simple sentence is, because length is not the be-all and end-all of everything in a sentence. When it comes to words, it's actually interesting. I haven't gone into this in this presentation, but just like I could show that long sentences or short sentences aren't necessarily clear, I could also show that short words are also not necessarily clear. So we can't use these oversimplistic guidelines. What we need to do with plain language is not get rid of all jargon. That's not the point. It's not the point to avoid jargon at all. But the point is to think about the jargon and what the reader needs to know. So there will be some jargon that a reader needs to know. Maybe it's the name of a software tool. Maybe it's the name of a particular feature. And the user will, need to know what will be disadvantaged if they don't know that word. So then you have to have that word, that jargon or technical word, and then just explain it or define it or show examples. If a word is completely unnecessarily complex, then of course you can avoid it and replace it with plain language. But we think about jargon, and we sometimes explain jargon rather than just, straight away avoiding all jargon. Some words we need to know. When it comes to sentence, we make sure that the sentences are clear in terms of the language we're using. It is important to realize that this standard is language neutral. So it's only going to give points that will apply to all languages. For English and many other languages, but certainly not all, we focus on subject, verb, object, and we focus on simple sentences rather than complex sentences. A simple or a compound sentence, so something with and in the middle, is easier to read than a complex sentence with a whole lot of subordinate clauses in it. I'm not going to do too much grammar here, but the idea is to use best practices to write sentences. And the final principle is that readers must be able to use the information, to evaluate the document continually while it's being developed, to co-create and to test with users. So it's going right through that process. Finally, let's come into more of the detail of which criteria you're going to use. Remember, I showed you that poll with the text base on the one side and the outcomes on the other side, and it seemed like I was saying readability isn't right, but I'm actually not saying that. What I do think is the text-based scoring can be used very effectively as a screening tool, because the truth is that if something fails a readability test completely by a big score, the chances are that it is going to not be good enough for users. And I've seen documents and content go to user testing, whereas anyone would have known that a particular sentence would have been a problem. So it is useful to do the automated type of text-based testing, a screening, and then move on to criteria-based and then outcomes. It's worth pointing out that with AI, we are starting to be able to do some of the criteria-based testing in an automated way too. Not all, but some. So there is a notion of more automated testing, and then finally, when things have gone through that, then we really can get into the user testing. And this is a fantastic thing because it means that we'll have a lot more time for strategic user testing and co-creation than we did when we were counting passive voice sentences in a document. So that's all that I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this keynote for TCUK. Please feel free to reach out to me direct. I am on LinkedIn, or you can go to our website. Thank you.